After 3 years, I'd convinced myself he was just naturally cold, until the day I found the corner of a photograph peeking out from under his winter coat. I say 3 years, because that's the frame I lived in. 3 years since I began measuring his affection by volume. How loudly he said he loved me, how often he kissed me in public, how much he reached for me in front of other people. For the purposes of this story, I'm keeping it to those 3 years. There were other chapters before, but the arc that broke me, that made me pack and unpack the word divorce in the margins of my day, was that recent span. It's important to mark that, because memory is an unreliable witness, and I want the truth of what happened in that window to be clear. At first, his quiet felt like the flavor of the man I'd married. He was efficient, economical with words, a man who ran meetings with the same flat calm he used when choosing cheese at the market. People at the office admired him for it. My mother told me he was mature and stable. My friends said he was one of those men who wears his heart inside his head. But 3 years is long enough to convert pattern into verdict. After a year of small omissions, forgotten anniversaries, a birthday cake that sat untouched in our kitchen because he didn't want to fuss, I started to lean on the explanation that comfort couldn't justify absence. By year 2, his reticence stopped being a quirk and became a lack. By year 3, his silences had names: indifferent, distant, emotionally unavailable. It's strange how 1,000 tiny incidents stack into an undeniable slope. A text with just K when I'd poured out a panic about money. A dinner where he ate mechanically and scrolled his phone, watching me as if I were an instructive animal at a petting zoo, observed, admired at a distance. The worst was not even what he did, but how other people framed it for me. His sister, when we had lunch with in-laws, rolled her eyes and said, loud enough for me to hear, "He's freezing. Don't take it personally, he's just not demonstrative." My mother-in-law would pat my shoulder and advise me, in a voice that meant she had survived worse. Women need to learn to accept different kinds of love. Their comments didn't comfort me. They made me ashamed for wanting something else. There were moments where I tried to read him like a book. I tried to decode his brief sighs, the particular way his jaw tightened when he listened. I compared notes with friends who recalled the man he had been before any of this, before promotions, before long hours, before the in-law commentary. Once, after a fight about his working late, he left early and texted, "We'll talk?" and then the next morning pretended the whole argument had run out of batteries. I began to believe that if love couldn't be loud in public, it might not be love at all. I started cataloging small proofs of absence the way other people collect photographs, in neat rows inside my head. Missed birthday breakfast. That time he didn't come to my sister's wedding because work was busy, but he posted a cordial photo online later that evening. The week he spent away in the city and called twice, both times brusque. The nights he came home at 2 in the morning and didn't wake me to say he was leaving. People offered explanations that confirmed my fears. A colleague at a party whispered that he'd been distant since a major case had gone sideways at the firm. My own imagination, fueled by other people's theories, filled the spaces with narratives of infidelity or indifference. The pressure came not only from absence, but from accumulation. At work, a rumor started. Some partners thought he'd pushed a colleague's idea into oblivion to secure his promotion. It made me see him differently. Cool, calculating, someone who could keep his heart under lock and key because it was practical to do so. Then our conversations turned into interrogations. I asked him how he felt. He responded by telling me how the company felt. I asked for 1 weekend away, and he calculated the cost-benefit out loud. When I spoke to his mother about it, she answered with a kind of tiredness that made me feel like a child nagging at a storm. "He's always protected himself," she said, "from early on. Don't ask him to change now." Still, none of this felt like grounds for the verdict I'd already issued. I began to believe that if he loved me, he would show me. The silence around our bed turned, in my head, into proof. So when the firm announced an internal audit, tightened security, files shuffled, days where he came home later than usual and said less than usual, I started to suspect that something else was at play. Maybe there were secrets that had nothing to do with me. Or maybe his coldness was a mask for something worse. The tipping moment was small, almost ridiculous. I needed a receipt. We were applying for a loan to fix the leak in the back of the house, the one we'd been promising ourselves we'd repair someday. It was a small practical step towards something normal. I had the estimates from the contractor, but the bank wanted proof of the last year's payments to utilities, an innocuous request. I opened his office drawer to find the folder with our joint paperwork, and there was no folder, only a stack of legal documents he kept for his clients. I'd never been inside that drawer much. I rarely went into his territory. His briefcase, his desk, the alcove where he kept his costly headphones and his highlighter pens. But that day, I needed one piece of paper. I slid my hand between folders and felt the smooth edge of a small box tucked in a corner behind the tax receipts. It was a shoebox, the kind people use to store things they can't decide to throw away yet. The lid was splayed, like it had been opened and shut many times, the cardboard softened along the edges. The smell hit me first, a faint perfume of old paper and a hint of his cologne, a scent so familiar I could trace where he'd been in the room by memory. I almost closed it and left it alone. An oddness tugged at my throat, but curiosity, sharpened by months of suspicion, pushed me to lift the lid. Inside, on top of a folded blue scarf and a pair of ticket stubs, there was a slim bundle of photographs wrapped in a rubber band. Nothing about this felt like an accusation at first. It felt like an intimate secret I had stumbled upon without permission. The photographs were glossy, the edges soft from handling, the top one face down. I slid my thumb beneath the corner and lifted. It was me. I remember the light in that photograph, soft, early morning light through our bedroom blinds. My hair was in the mess of sleep, and my lashes cast small shadows on my cheek. He had taken it from the doorway while I slept. I could see him in the reflection of the glass, a shadowed silhouette in a shirt that was too big. My first stupid reaction was possessive anger. How dare he take a photo of me without waking me? And then shame. It felt like a privacy violated, intimate in a way that made me flush. But as I turned the photo over, I saw his handwriting, tiny and neat in the bottom corner. The date and a note, 3 words. Close, not cold. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My brain tried to classify the image, voyeurism or devotion, a man who kept a photo to stare at when I left the room, or a man who was so private he preserved things instead of speaking them. For a long time I sat on the floor of his office with my back against the filing cabinet, turning those photos over one by one. There were others, a photograph of the 2 of us at a tiny diner I'd forgotten him taking me to, long before I'd realized he'd been planning surprises by himself. A blurry picture of my feet hanging off the edge of a hotel bed on a night he'd booked without telling me because I'd needed a break, according to a note on the back. Another showed a city promenade at dusk, the date written on the back matching the night I remembered arguing about a meeting he should have attended. There was a small theater ticket stub folded into one corner, its edge dog-eared. The note said simply, "For when you loved shows." Tucked between 2 photos was a folded scrap of paper, the kind you keep in a wallet, the ink smudged where he had pressed too hard. It read, "If you ever doubt, open." The words were clumsy with his penmanship, but deliberate. I felt like I was watching my marriage through a peephole, one that had been created by him for me to find only if I was brave enough to look. The evidence was neither an apology nor a confession. It was a trail made of small, honest things he had kept. Dates, tickets, quiet captures of my face when I thought I was alone. It reframed everything. All the times I had told myself his silence was cruelty now looked like the carefully folded restraint of a man who feared showing tenderness where it could be trampled. I sank my fingers into the stack, and a photograph slipped and fell across my shoes, landing face up. It was a picture of me laughing on a rooftop, hair catching the wind, the kind of candid joy you think only strangers see on holiday. On the back, in the same small handwriting, he had written a single line, "I kept this because you were free." There was a ticket stub from the diner we'd gone to on our first date, dated around the same time. Those dates lined up with nights when he'd seemed distant at home. I started flipping through my memory, matching his hidden mementos to my visible grievances. The silent dinners were perhaps not disdain, but a man offloading his worries of the day into a tight jaw. The curt texts might have been written in a courthouse corridor, or beneath fluorescent office lights where showing softness felt dangerous. It was impossible to tell if he'd intended for me to find them. The shoebox was not hidden in a vault. It was merely tucked at the back of a drawer he used for stationery. But he'd put it behind a stack of client files and an envelope of tax forms. A little deliberate misplacement if you believe in the idea of misplacing intentionally. The ticket stubs and the little notes had dates across 2 years of our life together. They were private in a way that made my chest ache with the weight of what I hadn't seen. There was also a photograph I couldn't decode at first. Him, taken from the side, watching me from across the room with a careful stillness I'd seen 1,000 times but never registered. He looked older in that image, tired at the temples, brows knotted as if he were concentrating on something fragile. The back of that one had a longer note, written in his slanted hand. I keep them because I learn how to love you by saving small things. I'm scared of what loud love does. I read it 3 times because the words felt like a gift and a confession at once. I could imagine the theory he'd grown into. His profession demanded a floor between public and private, between the judgment of partners and the vulnerability of home. I could imagine him learning that a visible show of feeling could be used against you in a negotiation or twisted in an office rumor. He'd been cautious of exposure, not of me. There was a difference, and in that small brown box, he'd put the evidence that he understood me intimately enough to preserve me when speech failed him. My first response, though, was not gratitude. Old hurt rose quicker than reason. The photos felt like a mirage, proof that he loved me cleverly hidden away, proof that everything I'd accused him of, remote heart, lack of warmth, was something else entirely. But where did that leave me? I had been pacing a room in my head, rehearsing a goodbye. I had joined conspirators in the form of friends and family who had nudged me toward leaving. I had packed the idea of starting over like an insurance policy. I let myself remember a few of those old cold moments against this new frame. The party where he hadn't kissed me in front of colleagues, maybe he was shielding me from gossip. The time he cut a vacation short and gave a perfunctory half-smile when I asked why. Maybe he was saving a conversation for a time he felt less exposed. The quick text, K. Maybe that was a break in a hearing or a moment he could spare me from his stress. Suddenly 1,000 slights rearranged themselves into the work of a man practicing a particular kind of love. Careful, secret, protective. But secrecy breeds suspicion in its own currency. If love is a language you keep to yourself, the absence of signal seems like nothing at all to the person waiting for it. I thought of all the nights I lay awake, counting the ways he did not reach for me, and the nights he must have sat, pen in hand, pressing small notes into the paper to remind himself of me. There was poignancy in that. And yet finding the photos felt like an intrusion, and I felt as if I had been given 2 contradictory truths at once. I didn't know then whether those little mementos were balm or bait. I sat on the office floor with that shoebox on my knees and the photos fanned like a deck before a hand of cards. The clock on the wall clicked in a way that made me aware of the outside world, the hum of the street, the muffled cheers from a neighbor's living room TV, while my private life rearranged itself in the quiet of an hour. For the first time in a long time, I doubted the verdict I'd been living under. If you've ever misread a silence for indifference, write me in the comments below. I could have used those voices. I folded the photos back in order. There were 3 objects I tucked carefully into my palm and slid into the pocket of my shirt. The photograph of me sleeping with his tiny note, close not cold, the theater ticket stub, and the folded scrap that said, if you ever doubt, open. It felt like carrying contraband. I hid them against my chest and tried to imagine what I would do next. There was a calculus to action. If I confronted him immediately, would I embarrass myself by jumping at a conclusion? If I confronted him later, would his explanation feel rehearsed? I walked the perimeter of his office like a small, timid animal, letting the idea of confrontation orbit my thoughts. He was due home at 6 for dinner. He often arrived later, of course. Sometimes he worked into the night and brought back a plastic container of takeout and a perfunctory apology. What would it look like to sit down at the table with those photos in my pocket and ask him, in front of candlelight or in the harsh fluorescence of the kitchen, to explain a life he had kept folded? Somewhere between the shoebox and the thought of confronting him, a new kind of fear took root in me, fear of being wrong. I had been preparing to leave, to take the dignity of my stubbornness and turn it into a clean decision. If his photos proved that my interpretation of his nature was skewed, I would have to confess to myself that I had let rumor and expectation and my own impatience erode trust. That would not be small. Pride showed me a neat exit. Truth required messy reckoning. The house smelled like lemon cleaner when I returned to the kitchen to make tea, a gesture as domestic as setting a trap. My hands trembled slightly as I put the kettle on. I could have drunk the tea to steady myself before he arrived, or I could have let it go cold and climbed the stairs with the photographs as an accusation. I dialed a friend's number, but didn't speak. Instead, I listened to the line ring and felt the absurdity of reaching out to someone who had been telling me to leave for months. I had arranged my life around a conclusion that was now being unpacked and examined by someone else. By me, actually. The photos demanded that I revise everything, but revision is a violent process. It requires cutting old sentences out of yourself. I wondered if he had ever meant for me to find them. The note, "If you ever doubt open," felt like an instruction left with tender care or a booby trap laid to test me. That ambiguity is a cruel thing because it forces choices not about facts, but about interpretation. Do I accept his private gestures as proof, or do I treat them as inadequate substitutes for the public tenderness I'd craved? There were practicalities too. If his reticence was a professional strategy, exposing him could hurt his career. If it was a protection, he'd explained it in that note as a fear that loud love would be turned into a weapon. Then revealing the photos publicly would make him vulnerable in the wrong ways. How much was my right to know balanced against his right to select his armor? Marriage is not a courtroom. It's plausible to keep certain things private, but at the same time, a relationship that runs on secrets is built on a shaky foundation. He walked in at 6:40, later than usual. I was in the kitchen with the kettle whistling, the photos wrapped in the towel I'd used to dry the dishes, my heart mapping out new and old wounds. He shrugged off his coat as if nothing had happened and kissed the air above my cheek the way he'd always done. An old, practiced affection that made me dizzy with the knowledge of how long he'd rehearsed being nonchalant. He hung his coat in the hall and smiled a quick smile. His face carried the kind of tiredness that made him look older. There was a crease between his brows I had never seen as sympathy, only concentration. "Hey," he said, and the sound of his voice folded into the room like a gesture. I felt suddenly absurd for having set up a confrontation like a scene, and then collapsing into ordinary life when he actually appeared. The kettle had stopped singing. I could have said nothing, could have slid the photos into the dishwasher and negotiated a night of small talk. But the box in the office and the scrap of paper in my pocket were heavy with intention now. They'd changed the terrain. "How was the audit?" I asked, because the voice of the world was still the easiest language. "It dragged on," he said. He leaned against the counter and scratched at a spot on his jaw as if it were a thing he needed to do to keep still. "There was a mess with a client file. They finally wanted everything organized. It's done now." I wanted to ask the question that had been building in my chest, the one where my finger hovered over the seam of his life. But instead, because truth is cowardly and urgent in equal measure, I asked a small thing first. "Do you remember where you put the receipt for the gutter repairs?" He blinked. "I thought I left it with the other invoices. Why?" "Bank wants it for the loan," I said. I could have shown him the letter, let the bank be the intermediary. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my shirt and produced the photograph of me sleeping, his neat handwriting visible even folded against my palm. His eyes went to it, the way a glass goes to light, quick, then entirely still. The expression that crossed his face was not the one I expected. He didn't look guilty in the theatrical way of someone who has been living a lie. He simply looked as if someone had opened a window in a closed room and the dust had started to fall. His mouth thinned, and for a second he looked 30 again. Sudden vulnerability softened his usual reserve. He started, then stopped. There was a long inhale, a catching. "You found them," he said finally, as if I had named something present in the room for too long. He didn't reach for the photograph. He let it remain in my hand like an accusation and a question in one. My throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" His hands went into his pockets like it steadied him. "I thought I was protecting you," he said slowly. "And maybe—" He searched for a word. "I was protecting myself too. I wanted to tear the truth from him. Why those photos? Why hidden? Why the small notes that read like confessions? But when someone who has always been controlled reveals a scrap of confession, you can't force the floodgates open without changing the current entirely. He was not a man to perform breakdowns. He was a man to stitch small, precise stitches and keep them out of sight." "Protecting me from what?" I pressed. "From the office? From people knowing how you feel? From me?" "From the consequences of being soft," he said. "From being judged. from being exposed in a room of men who measure you by how you take a win, not how you love at home. It was an answer, but not the one that would heal me outright. I felt both enraged and relieved, as if someone had slid me a piece of the map but kept the rest folded. He explained in halting sentences that in his world displays of sentiment could be whispered about, weaponized into weak evidence in negotiations, or used to shame him in front of bosses. He told me about a meeting years before when a partner had laughed at someone for wearing his wife's emotions like an accessory, and how that laughter had landed like cold water. He said he had been raised to read the room and stay stone-faced if that meant protecting something larger. It made a strange kind of sense. It did not absolve him. It didn't erase the nights I had spent wanting to be seen. It did, however, offer a context that turned indifference into strategy. He had turned tenderness inward rather than make it public where it could be dismissed or exploited. He had chosen to collect evidence rather than speak. "What does that make me?" I asked. "Someone you preserve in a box? An idea you keep to yourself?" He looked at the photos, then at me. "You are someone I was too afraid to risk on a whim," he said. "I thought if I kept these things, these small proofs, I could protect you from the things that might be said about us if I were suddenly transparent." His explanation sounded like a lover's alibi and a soldier's strategy at once. Maybe that's what he had become, a man who learned that the consequences of public softness could hurt his family in tangible ways. Maybe he had been trying to build a private archive of tender proofs in case the world asked him for his coldness. But I had been living in the coolness of his answer, not his archive, and there was a cost to that. I felt the tilt of two worlds, one where love is performance and another where love is preservation. Which of those realities wins in a marriage? Which one do you choose when your heart is hungry for both sight and protection? "I didn't mean to hide them," he added after a long breath, as if the admission itself was heavy. "I thought it was safer to keep them here, for me, for us, for later, when things—" He broke off. Later. The words sounded like a promise he couldn't keep. There were more things to ask. Why had he written, "If you ever doubt, open"? Had he imagined a future mistrust? Had he suspected a day when I would think him cold? Or had he left the breadcrumb intentionally because he could not bring himself to say the words, "I love you" across a dinner table? I wanted to know whether his secrecy was protective or manipulative. I wanted to know if he had ever thought of leaving them for me as atonement. Outside, a car horn sounded like the world asserting its indifference to the small domestic revolution occurring in our kitchen. He reached out, not touching the photograph, but hovering a hand near mine, the way someone testing water might do. "You deserve better than quiet," he said. "Not less, not hidden. I see that now." His voice had a thread of shame running through it, not the defense I had learned to expect. I thought about the months I had been planning to leave, the suitcases half packed in my closet like a patient with a chronic condition who keeps prescriptions in the drawer because optimism is a habit you can't break. My hope had been a tidy line between now and a life without him. The photographs had not dismantled my pain so much as relocated it. They were not absolution, they were context. They were a reason, maybe even an apology saved in print. I could have stopped right there, pressed the wound and torn it open to see the red underbelly. Instead, I stood in the kitchen holding the photograph and felt the whole complicated human truth land on me. People can be cruel by omission and also protective by secrecy. I was furious that he had chosen silence as a cloak. I was grateful that he had bothered to archive us. Those truths pulled against each other like two hands tied to the same rope. I wanted to hear everything, to demand a catalogue of his hidden life, to read the archive aloud like evidence. But the shoebox had been a tidy private thing, and the small notes between the photos had been intimate by design. There was a tenderness in the secrecy that made it hard to know if exposing it would be loving or invasive. He had kept these things as if holding a candle behind his back, safe from wind, warm only to himself until someone discovered the flame. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked again, softer now with a fatigue that felt like grief. He took a breath that seemed to pull him into childhood. "I thought the world would take them and use them against me," he said. "There are ways. Look at what people do at work, the things they say. I didn't want that for you." He looked very small when he said it. I thought if I kept them, they couldn't be used to hurt us. It was an imperfect answer. It left open several possible truths. That his silence had been a deliberate strategy, that his quiet had been motivated by care and fear in equal measure, and that he had underestimated the harm caused by withholding. He had saved his tenderness, and in doing so had orphaned me to the noise of the world. There was more to be said, there always is. But the kettle had gone cold on the stove, and the photograph in my hand felt heavier than it had a minute before. "Let's sit," he said finally, reaching for a mug as if rituals could salvage the moment. "Really sit. I will answer whatever you ask, if you want to know." I looked at him, at the man who had kept my sleeping face in a shoebox, at the crease between his brows that had softened when the photos made the air in the room different. My decision was not about whether to forgive on the spot, it was about whether to listen. The shoebox had altered the binary I had been living in, cold versus warm. It had introduced a third category, hidden love, and that, maybe more than anything, required translation. I nodded. The movement felt like stepping into a room with the lights off and trusting that the person who kept the matches could find the switch. We went to the living room and sat across from each other with a small table between us, the photos on the table as if they were the laws of a new country we'd been newly required to study. "Tell me everything," I said. He drew in a breath as the evening settled like a curtain. He began, hesitantly at first, then with the careful precision of a man reading from memory and hoping his recollection would be received as truth. He spoke of his upbringing, a father who equated displays of emotion with weakness, and a mother who had folded mourning into a stoic smile. He spoke of a partner at the firm who had once ridiculed sentimentality in public, how that laughter had echoed in rooms long after a joke, and how he had seen the consequences of being soft in a world that rewarded hardness. He told me about nights when he'd come home after layoffs and declined to talk because he didn't want me to shoulder the fear of his failing career. He told me about conversations he had never had because the words felt too dangerous when spoken in a place where someone could turn them into a weakness on a record. He confessed that he had been ashamed, not of loving me, but of the thought that loving me visibly could make me vulnerable in ways he could not control. He did not say everything in a tidy narrative. Emotions are messy in speech. There were gaps, sentences that trailed into silence, and moments where his hands found each other and the story folded back into him. But he did say enough to make me understand that his box of photos had been his attempt to make up for the things he couldn't vocalize. He explained that he believed, foolishly perhaps, that by collecting moments he could control them. By trapping a memory in photograph paper, he could keep it pure and unassailable. When he finished, the room was full of pages we both had read. I had questions about why he hadn't told me, about whether he had ever intended me to find them unbidden, about whether this secrecy had ever been punishment rather than protection. He answered frankly, embarrassed at times, defensive at others, but honest in a way that felt like the first honest thing between us in months. The night lengthened and the city hummed outside our windows. At some point in the conversation, the photos had stopped being just evidence and had become a language between two people who had slowly mislearned how to speak to each other. He held his hands out at last, as if gesturing to the bars he had built around his tenderness. "You were right to be angry," he said. "You were right to want more. I just didn't know how to give it without putting you in the line of fire." The words were not a balm, but they were a start. He was not asking for pardon so much as permission, to be understood, to be allowed to slowly dismantle a self he had made to survive. There was humility in that admission, and a danger. Sometimes a man who admits a flaw without changing it is only cataloging it for future performance. But for the first time in a long time, the space between us felt like it could be navigated. Outside, someone laughed in the stairwell, an ordinary sound that cut through the dense air between us. Inside, the shoebox sat on the table like a little altar. The photographs were not the final arbiter of our fate. They were a pivot that had made visible the private scaffolding of his love. I set my palm over the top photograph, his ink still visible, and felt the steady beat of my own heart. The decision lay ahead, sprawling and awkward and full of small moral choices. I could leave. I could demand transparency as a condition. I could demand he destroy the box to prove he was no longer hiding. I could ask him to bring the things into the light and let the world see his tenderness. Or I could understand that perhaps some protections are born of fear and need to be gently unlearned rather than forcibly removed. He watched me as if reading the indecision on my face. "Whatever you decide," he said quietly, "I will accept." I thought of the 3 years, of the months where my impatience had hardened my words, of the nights I'd rehearsed an exit that now felt premature. I thought of the photograph of my sleeping face, which had at first felt like violation, and how, turned over, it had become a small ledger of a man's attempts at love. There was no romantic flourish, no cinematic reconciliation, no epiphany that stitched everything into a neat moral. We were two flawed people sitting in a living room with evidence between us. The shoebox had given me something I had asked for, proof that his heart had been doing its work, even when his mouth had not. It had also given me a choice as old as any relationship, to forgive and insist on change, or to leave with the dignity of an outrage that had been validated. As he reached for the mug I had filled and left cooling, the doorbell rang, an abrupt, ordinary sound that was not part of our intimate reckoning. I stood up because someone at the door at that hour meant there was another story coming in. The sound of shoes on the doormat, the click of the lock, the neighbor's laugh saying something about a late meeting. These small intrusions reminded me that our private life was not hermetically sealed. Secrets bleed into the public, and sometimes the public insists on being part of the conversation. I left the photographs on the table and walked to the door, the shoebox a little monument in the center of the room. As I opened the door, a woman from 2 floors down stood there with a package and a look that betrayed the news she was about to deliver. Her face said that the world was about to press in with its own agenda. She held up her phone, as if the city and its small dramas had conspired to time this moment. "Are you the Hendersons?" she asked, breathless. "There's something about your husband. Have you seen the article?" In a breath, the firm and its rumors and the public sphere we had tried to keep ourselves separate from had intruded into the tidy private truth we had been sorting through. The photographs might prove tenderness to me, but the world had other ways of measuring a man. He had been cautious, now the world was knocking. I closed the front door with the weight of the shoebox heavy in the living room behind me, and the sound of my neighbor's words like a summons. Whatever we decided about the photos, there would be another reckoning soon. With colleagues, with in-laws, with the court of public opinion. My hand brushed the pocket where I had hidden the photograph of me sleeping. The note, "Close, not cold," was folded there like a wick. I could either bring it into the light to warm things, or keep it hidden and risk being burned by the cold judgments of others. The phone in my pocket buzzed with the first message. "Did you see the firm's post?" It was from a colleague. Something in me tightened, the instinct of self-preservation that had been part of our life for so long with him. The photograph in my hand felt suddenly frightening and vital. I looked back over my shoulder at the living room where 2 lives were spread like maps on a table. The decision hovered, luminous and dangerous. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the warm wood, hearing the city press in around us and knowing that in the next hour we would have to choose what kind of truth we would show first. The tender, hidden one, or the one everyone else already wanted to believe. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the wood because I needed something solid between my small, reeling head and the noise. The neighbor's words chased each other in my mind. Article, firm, post. My phone hummed like a heartbeat. Another message, then another. Each one pulled me back toward a world where his face was not the only verdict. When I stepped back into the living room, the photos looked more like evidence than they had an hour before. The shoebox sat where I'd left it, innocuous and charged. He had moved to the window and stood there with his hand on the glass, the city lights refracting over his shoulder. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work hours. It was the kind of tired people carry after carrying other people's judgment for too long. "Show me," I said quietly. Not a command, but something that needed to be asked. I needed him to explain the shape of the danger he'd feared, to draw the map of why he'd built a wall. He turned and came to the table. His fingers hesitated near the box, as if touching it were the same as touching a raw nerve. "There's a post," he said. "Someone reposted a private message and added a rumor. It's about decisions I made at work, professional stuff, but they've twisted it. They're saying I sacrificed ethics for advancement. They're saying things that make me look unfeeling and manipulative." He folded his hands together as if bowing them would hold them steady. "If they pin a softness on me, it becomes a weapon. People weaponize tenderness. I've seen it happen, used against families, in meetings, in negotiation rooms. I thought if I stayed mute about home, the only thing they could criticize were my professional choices, not my weaknesses." His explanation matched the half-confession in the box, but it did not simplify anything. I looked at him and thought of the ways men and women are taught to armor themselves differently. His armor had been silence and a shoebox. "What do you want to do about the article?" I asked. The question was practical because everything practical felt like a foothold. He ran a hand through his hair. "I can respond," he said. "Issue a statement, clarify decisions. But I can't let them use my home life as evidence. That would hurt you." The worry in his voice tightened like a band around his throat. "I didn't want you to be pulled into the mud." For a moment, I envied the clarity of his fear. It was directed, purposeful. My own anger was a scattershot weapon that always managed to miss its target. "You kept the box to protect me, and you kept it from me to protect me," I said. "It's a paradox heaped into a lifetime." He laughed, a brittle sound. "That's exactly it, a contradiction piled on top of a contradiction." The first knock on the living room window was literal. His sister had come over. I knew her stride. When she arrived unannounced at this hour, there would be no soft ride home. She let herself in without waiting. Her face said what she hadn't bothered to text: curiosity, the thrill of taking sides. "You found them?" she asked, taking the shoebox in one motion as if it were a prop and not a person's hidden archive. I felt a flash of something hot, protectiveness, indignation that someone else could turn our private things into theater. He moved so his body was between me and her, the old habit of putting himself forward returning like an automatic tide. "Don't," I said, and it came out softer than I intended. She looked at me like I had intruded on her enjoyment. "I thought you were leaving," she said, eyes darting between his face and mine. "You—" She didn't get to finish. In that pause, I had to choose the posture I would take in the world. Would I be the woman who allowed the private to be paraded for gossip, or the woman who insisted that tenderness not be used as a spectacle? "These are ours," I said. It was a small possessive, not because I owned the photos, but because I refused to let them be emptied of meaning by someone else's curiosity. "They're ours to talk about," she scoffed. "Right. After 3 years of him being distant, you suddenly find a shoebox and decide to stay?" It was the kind of cutting observation that used to land as a blunt instrument. For months I had been a collecting point for such phrases. "You should know better. Don't be naive. Men like that don't change." But tonight the line on my face was different. I had just handled a man whose tenderness had been folded into paper. I had seen the handwriting he used to preserve me. I had also seen his fear. 3 years, I said to her, and to him, and to the room. "It's not that simple. He didn't stop loving. He changed how he protected us." The sister's mouth opened and closed. She wore indignation as if it were a favor. Before she could tilt the conversation into another gossip, there was another knock, this time more formal. My mother-in-law stood there, the kind of woman who liked to believe that loud opinions were the measure of wisdom. Her hat was on crooked, as if she had dashed from a bus stop. "I heard," she said, voice pitched into accusation and concern combined. "Is it true? He's been, what they say, heartless?" I looked from face to face, the sister, the mother, the husband who had kept my sleeping face in a box. The thing I'd thought would be a private reckoning had become a room full of witnesses. "He kept a box," I said. "He kept it because he was afraid, but he kept it. He kept me." "Kept you?" my mother-in-law echoed. "You mean he hid you? He hid his wife." The words were meant to wound. I felt them bruise, but I also felt a strange clarity. "He hid tenderness, yes," I said, "but he didn't hide me. If he had, there wouldn't be a theater ticket from our first date, and there wouldn't be a note that said, 'If you ever doubt, open.' He saved proofs, not distance." For a second, the house became a courtroom. My mother-in-law's eyes sharpened, and she looked at him like she was measuring the value of the man in the currency of public displays. "Then why keep them hidden?" she demanded. "Because he feared they'd use it," I answered before he could. I had decided my voice would not be the one to point fingers tonight. He feared that being tender would be twisted into weakness. He was trying to protect us from being weaponized. Her face softened, then hardened in rapid motion. Family dynamics have a way of rearranging when they smell an opportunity to assert judgment. She was quick to rebuke, quicker to advise, and both of those instincts had always sat uneasily with me. I could already imagine her turning the shoebox into a lecture. You must be seen to be respected. The age-old prescription for women who want to belong to families built on displays. Whatever your reason, she said finally, we live in a world where appearance matters. You cannot be preserved in a box. I wanted to shout that I wasn't seeking preservation, I was seeking recognition. But my words would have landed like pebbles against the dam of family certainty. Instead, I took a breath and offered something steadier. We're not deciding anything tonight, I said. We found things, we will speak about them, but this... I gestured to the shoebox, to the photos, to the small, intimate archive spread like a map between us. This is not fuel for rumor. If you want to help, be kind. If you want to judge, leave. There was a ridiculous beat of silence. The sister's jaw worked like it was processing a new and inconvenient fact. My mother-in-law pursed her lips, which meant she was not yet conquered, but was considering strategy. They took in the living room as if it had become a territory to be navigated. That night, the firm's post bloomed like some invasive plant across my phone. Screenshots, comments, speculation. People I worked with messaged me in combinations of pity and curiosity. My inbox smelled like the outside world had decided it had a right to our private weather. I wanted to delete everything and bury our life under a stone and ask him, was that the danger you feared? That the internet and the world would wrench tenderness into scandal? But I also remembered the paperslip in his pocket. I will accept whatever you decide. There was a quiet dignity in that line. It was not a plea for unconditional pardon. It was a recognition that the other person had agency. Maybe that's what had changed. He had folded his love into a box, but he had not thought he deserved forgiveness without it. We made a plan that night, small and careful. He would go to work in the morning and ask for a meeting with the partners, not to make a show of himself, but to put into words what had happened and why the public speculation was dangerous and false. He would not, I insisted, use the photos as shield or proof in any public forum. Those things belonged to us. But he would also not continue to hide them so completely that they became instruments of our mistrust. Bring one or two things into the light, I said. Not for them, for us, for me. He hesitated, the old habit of calculating a risk resurfacing. What if bringing them into the light destroys more than it saves? Then we'll handle what we've asked for, I said. But I need to know you won't hide behind silence again as if it absolves you. We agreed. He would speak at work as a professional, clarifying his choices and denouncing the rumor. Privately, he would begin to make tenderness visible in small, consistent ways. He promised to replicate the shoebox ritual in reverse. Instead of reserving tenderness for dangerous solitude, he'd start leaving small proofs where I could see them. An envelope on my dresser, a ticket stub on the fridge, a note in my coat pocket once a month. Not grand gestures, consistent ones. Work was brutal in the daylight. The partners called him into a meeting, and their faces were the precise map of corporate disapproval, firm, crisp, concerned about reputation. He spoke with a restraint that was almost practiced, a man who had been rehearsing the language of defense his whole life. He clarified decisions, answered questions, and, in an unexpected move that surprised both of us, he spoke about boundaries. I cannot let my private life be turned into a weapon, he told them calmly. My choices at work are mine to answer for. Personal tenderness is not evidence of professional impropriety. It was a careful line. There was no theatrics, no dramatic admissions. But his statement was enough to puncture the rumor mill with the quiet authority of someone not willing to be defined by gossip. The post still circulated, people still commented. But part of the rumor lost traction. The firm, interested in settling the storm, leaked no more. Professional bodies, it turned out, cared more about process than about gossip. They asked for documents and hearings, not scandalized narratives of private life. He complied with the process. I sat by, a spectator of a man I knew intimately who had to defend himself to a world that measured virtue differently. Outside the office, inside the house, different battles simmered. His sister demanded transparency in ways that felt performative. If you love her, show it, she said bluntly one morning, as if love were a social media post. But there were also moments when she softened, when she came over with a small cake and admitted that maybe she'd been too quick to judge. My mother-in-law, after a week of gossip and household counsel, came to me quietly one night and said, I didn't know how much he kept inside. It was a small surrender. The true test, for me, came not in public, but in the small rooms of ordinary life. The kitchen at dawn, the hallway before work, the car when we drove in separate directions. He started leaving a single photo on the bedside table once a week. Nothing showy, just a small printed image with a date and a one-line explanation. No grand declarations, just consistent, visible proofs that he was attempting translation, turning what he'd kept in the dark into a language we both could read. One evening, a month after the discovery, we sat on the roof of our building because he had the idea that the sky would be a way of resetting things. The city below murmured like an audience that had not voted yet. He took my hand in the dark in a way he hadn't done for a long time, no theatrics, just fingers lacing, and reached into his coat. I felt the rub of paper against my palm and saw a small photograph, fresh and glossy. It was a picture of us at the diner where we'd had our first date. It wasn't the same as the old ticket stub tucked in the shoebox. This was new. He had asked someone to take it, an intentionality about publicness that made me breathe differently. On the back he had written, in his messy hand, "I want you visible." Why now? I asked, and didn't need the answer to be perfect. I needed it to be real. "Because I don't want my love to be a secret that hurts you," he said simply. "I was trying to protect you from being used. I see now that by hiding it, I let others do the damage instead." I let myself forgive him in that moment, not because the hurt evaporated, but because the memory of the shoebox had already done its work. It had shown me the shape of his fear and the means by which he preserved me. It had not excused the long months of absence, but it had given me a map. We did not suddenly slip into some naive cinematic reconciliation. Trust is not a light switch. It is the slow work of proving oneself again and again. He learned to answer me first when I asked how his day had been, even if it meant telling me only a fragment. I asked him to be patient when my anger rose, to explain the small things rather than retreat into silence. We set rules. No more secrets that meant another person could hold power over us. No more shoeboxes of tender proof that were only to be revealed in the event of suspicion. He didn't erase the box, I would not have wanted him to, but he moved 2 photos from it and pinned them to the fridge like a flag. There were hard nights. There were evenings when in-laws recited old judgments like they were family recipes. But there were also mornings when he left a note in my handbag that simply said, "Coffee at 8?" A small, visible offer to be present. He started attending family dinners with a new ease, not because he wanted to perform, but because he had decided that some vulnerability could be exercised publicly without being fatal. When my friends asked whether the photos had changed everything, I gave them the honest answer: they changed the way I saw him. They didn't automatically change the way he acted. People aren't corrected by evidence alone. They are corrected by their willingness to change. He had chosen to take the risk of being visible, one small act at a time. Months later, when the firm had put the rumors to rest with the kind of slow bureaucracy that cleans wounds with antiseptic, the public noise quieted. The sister had her moments of triumph and remorse. The mother-in-law, pointed brow softened, brought over a plate of food as an offering of peace. The shoebox went back into a drawer, not hidden in the way it had been, but placed where we could reach it without having to dismantle the house of our lives. One Sunday, in a soft panic of domesticity, we took a photo together in the living room. I set the camera on a shelf, slowed the timer, and we stood close. He looked awkward and beautiful and present. When the flash clicked, the image wasn't perfect. My hair was askew, his tie crooked, but it was entire and visible in ours. We printed it and put it on the mantel. No note, no shoebox required. It was a small rebellion against the idea that tenderness must be private to survive. In the end, the shoebox had not been a trap nor a bomb. It was a turning point. It forced me to admit that my verdict had been partial. It forced him to admit that his protection had sometimes been a kind of disappearance. We chose a middle path, neither heroic nor tidy. We rebuilt on a foundation that required both of us to trade the safety of certain armor for the vulnerability of daylight. There were things left unresolved, old hurts that would need months, perhaps years, to settle into gentler shapes. But the act of choosing, together and with eyes open, felt like an answer to the question the photos had posed. Did hidden love count as love? My answer had changed. Love that is hidden is not less real, it is different. Whether it sustains a marriage depends on whether it can be learned into speech. Sometimes, late at night, I still pull out that top photograph. the one of my sleeping face, and read the neat ink on the back until the letters blur. Close, not cold, it says. I press my thumb into the corner, feeling the score of where his fingers had smoothed it down. The memory of that first discovery is not a prize to be displayed or a wound to be reopened. It is a reminder that people protect in strange ways and that love can show up as both absence and accumulation. If someone had asked me 3 years ago whether I would have chosen to stay based on a shoebox, I might have given a quick, indignant no. Today I answer differently, not because the shoebox absolved everything, but because it opened a conversation we both had to learn to keep. We have rules now, more talk and fewer locks. Visible tenderness practiced in small, quiet gestures. A willingness to bring private proofs into daylight, not for applause but for accountability. No more boxes where evidence is used as leverage. And on the mantel, the new photograph waits like a small contract between us.